A werewolf shifter romance, specially written for you. Prologue. My name is Elara. To my father, I was a negotiation tool. To the Silver-Crest pack, I was collateral. To the rogues who bought me, I was dinner. But they all forgot one thing. When you strip someone of their name, their home, and their future, you leave them with nothing to lose and the freedom to burn it all down. The air in the great hall of the Silver-Crest smelled of expensive pine and ancient rotting tradition. My father, Alpha Thorn, stood on the dais, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that usually signaled protection. Today, it signaled my end. "The debt is settled," he said, not looking at me. He was looking at the man standing at the back of the hall, a scarred, towering rogue named Malachi. Malachi didn't wear the polished armor of our guardians. He wore pelts, dirt, and a smile that looked like a scar. I stood in the center of the hall, my wrists bound in silver-lined silk. It didn't hurt, but it chafed, a reminder that even my father's kindness was a shackle. "She is the finest we have," my father continued, his pride making my stomach turn. "High blood, fertile, and trained in the histories. Her life for the mining rights to the Black Ridge. The trade is made." Malachi stepped forward. The hall went silent. To my pack, rogues were mindless beasts who had lost their humanity. They were the bogeymen we were told stories about to keep us obedient. And here I was, being handed over like a sack of grain to their king. Malachi reached out a hand, his fingers calloused and stained with the earth. He didn't grab me. He just touched the silk on my wrists. "She's too clean," he rasped. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a whisper that felt like a blade. "She won't last a week in the waste." "Then that is your loss, rogue," my brother Kalen sneered from the sidelines. He was already wearing the cloak that should have been mine. I looked at my father one last time. I waited for a flicker of regret, a twitch in his jaw. Anything to show he saw a daughter instead of a debt payment. He just turned his back. As Malachi led me out of the hall, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind us, I felt something snap inside me. It wasn't my spirit. It was the link. The psychic tether that bound me to the Silver-Crest pack, the one that forced me to feel my father's authority, suddenly went cold and dead. I wasn't a Silver-Crest anymore. I was nothing. And in that nothingness, I realized something terrifying. If I was no longer bound by their laws, then their laws no longer protected them from me. Have you ever felt like the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the ones holding you back? How did you find the strength to walk away? Welcome back to the den, everyone. I'm so thrilled you're here for the premiere of our newest legend. If you love stories where the property becomes the prophet and the victim becomes the victor, you are in exactly the right place. Before we witness Elara's first steps into the wild, do me a huge favor, smash that like button and subscribe to Lily's Heart Tales. Your support is the fuel that keeps these stories burning bright. Now, let's dive into the cold, hard reality of the border. Chapter 1. The transition from the manicured lawns of the Silver-Crest estate to the dead zone was more than just a change in scenery. It was a change in the very air I breathed. Here, at the border where the forest turned to jagged, ash-colored rock, the civilized world ended. 2 Silver-Crest guards, men I had known since I was a pup, men who had once bowed to me, now shoved me forward with the butts of their silver-tipped spears. They didn't look me in the eye. To them, I wasn't Elara, the Alpha's daughter, anymore. I was a check that had been cashed. "Easy with the merchandise," Malachi's voice cut through the wind. He was leaning against a withered oak, his arms crossed over a chest scarred by claws and time. Behind him stood 3 others. They didn't stand in the rigid, brainwashed formation of my father's soldiers. They were loose, predatory, and smelled of wood smoke and old blood. These were the bone eaters, the rogues, the unlinked. The lead guard spat on the ground. "She's your problem now, Malachi. Don't come looking for a refund when she dies of fright before midnight." The guards turned and left without a backward glance. The silence that followed was heavy. I stood there in my torn silk gown, shivering as the mountain wind bit into my skin. Malachi walked toward me. He was massive, easily a head taller than my father. He stopped inches away, his scent hitting me like a physical wave. Rain, pine, and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. "You're shaking," he observed. It wasn't a taunt. It was a fact. "It's cold," I snapped, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "And I was just sold like a breeding mare to a pack of murderers. Excuse me if I'm not in a festive mood." One of the rogues behind him, a lean woman with eyes the color of flint, let out a bark of a laugh. "She's got teeth, Malachi. Maybe she won't be a waste of rations after all." Malachi didn't laugh. He reached out and grabbed the silver-lined silk on my wrists. With a single, effortless jerk, he snapped the bindings. I stared at my red, chafed wrists. I was free of the rope, but I was still a prisoner of the waste. "We aren't a pack," Malachi said, turning to walk toward the dark, jagged horizon. "We don't have an alpha to tell us when to eat or when to breathe. Out here you aren't high blood, you're just another mouth. If you want to survive, you walk. If you want to die, stay here. The scavengers will have you by dawn." He didn't wait for me. He didn't offer a hand. He just walked. I looked back at the Silver-Crest border. The lights of the great hall were visible in the distance, warm, safe, and built on a foundation of lies. I looked at the dark, terrifying expanse of the gray waste ahead. I realized then that my father hadn't just sold me. He had accidentally given me the only thing he truly feared: autonomy. I took my first step into the dirt, the silk of my dress tearing on the thorns, and followed the monsters into the dark. The gray waste wasn't just a name, it was a physical weight. The ground was choked with volcanic ash and stunted trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching for a sun that never quite broke through the haze. My lungs burned. My silk slippers had long since disintegrated, leaving my feet bleeding and caked in grit. But I didn't stop. Every time I lagged, the woman with the flint-colored eyes, Riven, would nudge me with the tip of her boot. Not enough to hurt, but enough to remind me that princess wasn't a rank here. "Why don't you just kill me?" I gasped, stumbling over a jagged root. "My father already has the mining rights. My death wouldn't change the contract." Riven looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Killing you is easy, little wolf. But out here, we don't do things because they're easy. We do them because they're necessary." We reached their camp just as the first moon rose. It wasn't a majestic stone fortress like the Silver-Crest. It was a network of caves and reinforced lean-tos tucked into the side of a canyon. There were no banners, no golden statues of ancestors, but there were wolves. Dozens of them. And as I looked at them, my heart stopped. These weren't the mindless killers from my father's bedtime stories. I saw an old man with a missing ear mending a fishing net. I saw a mother, clearly a low-caste omega from some distant pack, grooming her pup. They all had one thing in common: the empty gaze. In the Silver-Crest, we were all connected by the Alpha Link. I could feel my father's moods, his commands, his very presence in the back of my mind. It was a constant hum of belonging. These wolves were silent. There was no psychic tether connecting them to Malachi. They were individuals, separate and solitary, working together by choice rather than by mental compulsion. "They're broken," I whispered, feeling the terrifying vastness of my own internal silence now that my father had cut me off. "They're awake," Malachi corrected, stopping at the edge of a central fire pit. He turned to face me. "In your pack, you are a cell in a body. If the brain, the alpha, decides to cut off a finger to save the hand, you die and you thank him for the privilege. Here, if you lose a finger, you learn to fight with 9. A large male rogue approached us, dragging a freshly killed caribou. He didn't bow to Malachi. He didn't offer him the choice cut as an alpha's tribute. He simply dropped it and took a piece for himself. The logic of the waste is simple, Elara, Malachi said, carving a hunk of meat with a jagged obsidian knife and tossing it to me. It hit the dirt at my feet. No one is coming to save you. No one is going to tell you what to do. You eat what you kill, and you protect what you love. There are no debts here, only survival. I looked at the raw meat in the dirt. I looked at the monsters who were actually just refugees from a system that had found them inadequate. I picked up the meat. I wiped the dirt off on my ruined silk dress, and I ate. For the first time in my life, I wasn't eating because it was dinner time at the Alpha's table. I was eating because I chose to live. The brutal logic of the rogues was starting to make more sense than the honor of the packs. My father sold me to pay a debt, but he forgot that once a debt is paid, the slate is clean. Chapter 2. In the Silver-Crest, training meant dancing in the moonlight and learning the etiquette of the hunt. In the Grey Waste, training meant not dying before the sun went down. Riven stood over me, her flinty eyes reflecting the harsh morning light. I was on my back again, the breath knocked out of me for the 10th time. My hands were raw, and my silk-trained muscles screamed in a language they had never spoken before. "Get up, collateral," Riven spat. "A predator doesn't wait for you to catch your breath." "I am not a predator," I wheezed, pushing myself up from the freezing mud. I was an Alpha's daughter. I was meant to be the heart of the pack, not its claws. "And look where that heart got you." Malachi's voice drifted over from a nearby ledge. He was watching me with that maddeningly neutral expression. "Sold for dirt and rock. Your heart is a liability, Elara. Out here, only the brain and the bone matter." Riven lunged again. She was faster, stronger, and fueled by a lifetime of resentment. She swung a heavy, improvised club made of bone and leather. I braced for the impact, my mind racing. In the Silver-Crest, we were taught the great lore, the biological secrets of our kind. Most wolves ignored them, focusing on the glory of the kill. But I had spent my girlhood in my father's library. I knew the nerve locus. I knew the pressure ties. As Riven's arm came down, I didn't try to block her strength with my weakness. Instead, I stepped into her guard. I remembered the diagrams from the Tome of the First Blood. I knew exactly where the shift joint was located, the tiny cluster of nerves behind the elbow that remained vulnerable even in human form. I didn't punch. I pressed. 2 fingers, hard and precise. Riven's arm went instantly numb. The club clattered to the ground. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. She tried to shift, to let her wolf form heal the nerve shock, but I was already moving. I swept her leg, not with power, but with the leverage I knew her anatomy couldn't resist. For the first time, Riven was the one in the dirt. The camp went silent. The rogues stopped their work. Malachi stood up, his gaze sharpening. "What was that?" Riven hissed, clutching her deadened arm. "That wasn't a wolf's strike." "It's a high-blood secret," I said, my voice finally steady. I wiped a streak of mud from my cheek. My father spent years teaching me how the wolf body works so I could be a better vessel for the pack's future. He thought he was teaching me how to be a mother. He didn't realize he was teaching me how to be a surgeon. I looked at Malachi. "You think my education is a burden? You think I'm just a princess? Your rogues fight with rage. They fight with hunger. But I fight with knowledge." I realized then that the Silver-Crest hadn't just given me away. They had sent an expert on their own weaknesses directly into the hands of their enemies. The myths of the Alpha's divine power were just biology, and biology can be manipulated. The nights in the Grey Waste were louder than the days. They were filled with the psychic static of wolves who had been forcibly torn from their packs. I would lie awake, feeling the phantom echoes of my father's authority, a cold, distant thrumming in the back of my skull that reminded me I was still, technically, his. But as I sat by the dying embers of the communal fire, I noticed a young rogue named Jaren. He was shaking, his eyes rolled back, clutching his head in agony. "Alpha sickness," Riven whispered, standing in the shadows. His old alpha is calling the pack to a great hunt. Even though Jaren was exiled, the psychic tether is still there, pulling at his brain like a hook in a fish's mouth. It'll eventually drive him mad. I looked at Jaren. I could almost see it. Not with my eyes, but with that defect my father's healers had always whispered about. They called me a leaky vessel because I never fully absorbed the alpha link. I was always a bit detached. I walked over to him. Malachi watched me from the mouth of his cave, his eyes narrowed. I didn't ask for permission. I placed my hand on Jaren's forehead. In the Silver-Crest, we were taught that the alpha link was a sacred, unbreakable bond. But as I closed my eyes, I didn't see a bond. I saw a parasite, a jagged, pulsing vein of psychic energy connecting Jaren's mind to a man hundreds of miles away. I felt a surge of cold fury. My defect, that emptiness in my mind that had made me a disappointment to my father, began to expand. It wasn't just a lack of connection. It was a void. I reached out with my mind, not to grasp the link, but to negate it. I pictured my mind as a black hole, an absolute silence that swallowed all sound. I wrapped that silence around the pulsing tether in Jaren's head. Snap. The sound wasn't physical, but it echoed through the camp like a thunderclap. Jaren's body went limp. The shaking stopped instantly. He took a long, shuddering breath and opened his eyes. For the first time, they were clear. The alpha sickness was gone. "It's quiet," Jaren whispered, touching his own temples in wonder. "The screaming in my head. It's just gone." I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at my palms. They felt cold, as if I'd just dipped them into a frozen lake. "You severed it," Malachi said, stepping into the firelight. His voice was no longer neutral. It was laced with a dark, dangerous awe. "That shouldn't be possible. Only an alpha's death can break a link like that." "I didn't kill his alpha," I said, standing up, the wind whipping my ruined silk dress around my legs. "I just erased the law. I found the void between the commands." I realized then what I was. I wasn't just a rogue. I was a system killer. If I could do this to one wolf, I could do it to an army. The alphas ruled through the link, through the voice in our heads that forced us to obey. If I could take away their voice, they were just men with sharp teeth. And I was the one who knew exactly where to bite. Chapter 3. The Grey Waste was a land of absolute freedom, but I was quickly learning that absolute freedom looked a lot like a slow-motion suicide. Without the alpha link to coordinate them, the rogues were a collection of jagged edges. Arguments broke out over a scrap of leather. Fights turned bloody over a perceived slight from 3 years ago. Malachi allowed it. He believed in the purity of the struggle. But I saw it for what it was, a waste of talent. The breaking point came when Graves, a massive, scarred brute who had been a lead enforcer in a northern pack, pinned a scrawny young scout to the ground. Graves had a jagged piece of obsidian held to the boy's throat. "He stole my share of the marrow!" Graves roared, his eyes flashing a chaotic, unlinked yellow. "In the waste, you take or you die. That's the only rule." Malachi stood by, his arms crossed. He wasn't going to stop it. To him, this was just the natural order. "Stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange, resonant quality that seemed to dampen the air around us. Graves laughed, not even looking up. "Go back to your cave, princess. The adults are settling a debt." I didn't argue. I walked into the center of the circle and released the void. I didn't attack Graves. I simply projected that absolute freezing silence I had used on Jaren. I draped it over the entire circle. The psychic static of their rage was suddenly sucked into a vacuum. Graves felt his strength flicker as the adrenaline in his system, usually fueled by predatory instinct, was neutralized by the overwhelming calm I projected. He dropped the obsidian blade, gasping for air that felt suddenly too thin. "You speak of debts," I said, stepping over the blade. I looked Graves in the eye, then turned to the entire camp. But look at you. You are all free of your alphas, yet you are still slaves to your anger. You are dying because you have no center. We don't want a center, Riven shouted from the crowd. We don't want another alpha telling us how to bleed. I am not an alpha, I replied, my voice sharpening. An alpha demands your soul. I demand your word. I knelt and picked up the obsidian blade. I held it out between Graves and the boy. This is the first rule of the land, I declared. No wolf shall be bound by blood, and no wolf shall be silenced by force. If you have a grievance, you bring it to the circle. If you spill the blood of your own, you are no longer a rogue. You are a ghost. You will be cast out, and my void will follow you until you forget your own name. It was a gamble. I was a princess, threatening warriors. But the silence I carried was terrifying to them. It was a power they didn't understand. Malachi stepped forward, his eyes locked on mine. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the canyon. Then he looked at Graves. She's right, Malachi rasped. We're not an army, we're a graveyard, and I'm tired of burying my own. He turned to me and gave a short, sharp nod. It wasn't an act of submission. It was an act of recognition. I realized then that I wasn't their guest anymore. I was their legislator. I had given them the one thing they lacked, a reason to trust the person standing next to them. The Grey Waste was no longer just a place to hide, it was becoming a place to live. Under the first rule, the atmosphere of the camp shifted. The frantic, jagged energy of desperate wolves began to smooth out into a steady hum of purpose. In my father's pack, roles were assigned by birth or by the alpha's whim. If you were born a submissive, you stayed a submissive. Here I introduced something the packs considered heresy, the covenant of choice. You were a master weaver in the South Reach, I said to a scarred wolf named Mara, who had been used as a frontline brawler because of her size. Why are you holding a spear when your hands know the language of the loom? The alpha said I was a soldier, she muttered, staring at her calloused palms. The alpha isn't here, I replied, handing her a bundle of harvested mountain flax. The law says your talent belongs to you, not a crown. We need warmth more than we need another mediocre guard. Slowly, the silent union took shape. We didn't have a psychic link to coordinate us, so we had to do something revolutionary. We talked. We held circles of intent where we planned the winter stores and the defensive perimeters. I used my high blood education to create a written code. In a world where only alphas were taught to read and write, I was giving the rogues a weapon they had never dreamed of, the written law. If it is written, I told Malachi as we sat by a map of the territory, it cannot be changed by the mood of a man. The law is the alpha now. Even you have to follow it. Malachi looked at the parchment, then at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just respect, but a deep, resonant pride. You're turning us into a nation, Elara, he rasped. The Pax will see this as a declaration of war. A wolf who thinks for himself is the one thing a king cannot control. Let them look, I said, leaning back. They sold me to the waste because they thought I was a debt to be paid. They didn't realize I was the auditor coming to check their books. By the end of the month, we had a functioning irrigation system, a school for the pups who had been cast out, and a defensive line that relied on strategy rather than brute force. We weren't a pack of animals anymore. We were a sovereignty. But as our lights grew brighter in the waste, I knew the shadows of the Silver-Crest were watching. My father wouldn't like that his collateral was suddenly building a kingdom that made his look like a cage. Chapter 4. The scouts brought the news at dawn. A contingent of Silver-Crest warriors, led by the gold and crimson banner of the Alpha's heir, was approaching the canyon. They weren't hiding. They were marching with the arrogance of men who believed they still owned the ground beneath their feet. I stood on the precipice of the canyon, looking down at the small army. In the center, riding a white stallion, was my brother, Kalen. They look like peacocks in a graveyard, Riven muttered, checking the tension on her bow. Should we give them a warm welcome? Wait, I said. I wasn't wearing the silk rags of a princess anymore. I wore boiled leather armor, sturdy boots, and a cloak made from the wolves who had tried to challenge our new laws. My hair, once braided with pearls, was now tied back with a simple leather thong. As Kalen reached the mouth of our settlement, he halted his horse. He looked up at the caves, his face twisted in a mask of pity and disgust. "Elara!" he shouted, his voice amplified by the alpha link so it echoed off the stone walls. "Father has heard that the rogues haven't killed you yet. In fact, he's heard you've made yourself quite useful in organizing these strays." I didn't answer. I gestured for the gates, built of iron oak and reinforced with rogue ingenuity, to open. I walked out alone to meet him. Kalen dismounted, a smirk playing on his lips. "You look terrible, sister. The waste hasn't been kind to your complexion. But father is feeling charitable. The mining rights in the Black Ridge have proven complicated. He wants to renegotiate the treaty. He's here to reclaim his property and bring you home." I stopped 10 paces from him. The Silver-Crest warriors behind him shifted, their hands on their swords. They expected me to weep. They expected me to run to his arms. "Property?" I repeated. The word felt like ash in my mouth. "A debt was paid, Kalen. The transaction was finalized at the border. I don't belong to the Silver-Crest. I don't belong to Thorn. And I certainly don't belong to you." "Don't be difficult," Kalen snapped, his eyes flashing that familiar alpha gold. He used his command voice, the psychic weight that usually forced every member of our pack to their knees. "I am your brother and your future alpha. I command you to come home." The air rippled with the force of his will. The rogue scouts on the ridges winced, feeling the static of his voice. But I just stood there. I didn't even blink. The void in my mind simply swallowed his command. To me, his alpha voice sounded like a petulant child screaming in a distant room. Kalen's smirk vanished. He stumbled back a step, his face paling. "What? Why didn't you kneel? The link, I can feel it's still there, but it's like I'm shouting into a grave." "The link is a ghost, Kalen," I said, stepping closer until I was in his personal space. I was shorter than him, but in that moment, I felt like the mountain itself. "You didn't come here for me. You came because you're afraid. You heard that the monsters are building a city. You heard that the debt you sold is now the law of the land." I looked over his shoulder at the warriors. "Go back to our father. Tell him the collateral is gone. Tell him that if he wants to talk to the sovereign of the waste, he needs to bring a diplomat, not a debt collector." Kalen's face shifted from confusion to a violent, crimson rage. To an alpha heir, a refusal isn't just an insult, it's a glitch in reality. He couldn't comprehend a world where his voice didn't move mountains. Or women. "You've spent too much time rolling in the dirt with these curs," Kalen hissed, his hand dropping to the hilt of his silver-etched blade. "Seize her! If she won't walk, drag her. We'll break this rogue fever out of her in the dungeons." 6 of his elite guards lunged forward. These weren't just soldiers, they were bond warriors, their minds fused with Kalen's in a tight, aggressive combat link. They moved with a terrifying hive mind precision. I didn't draw a weapon. I didn't even shift. "Wait," I whispered, but I didn't say it with my throat. I said it with the void. As the first guard reached for my throat, I didn't block his hand. I reached out and touched his chest, right over the sternum, the physical anchor point of the psychic link. I didn't push him. I simply inhaled. I pulled the silence out of my soul and pushed it into his connection. The effect was horrific for them. To a wolf who has spent every second of his life bathed in the warm, constant hum of the pack link, sudden silence is like being thrown into a vacuum. The guard didn't just stop. He collapsed, clutching his head and screaming as his brain tried to process the absolute isolation. I moved to the next, and the next. "What are you doing to them?" Kalen roared, drawing his sword. He swung at me, but I stepped inside his reach, just like I had with Riven. I tapped the nerve cluster in his wrist, and his sword clattered into the dirt. "I'm showing you the interest, Kaelin," I said, my voice echoing in the eerie silence of the fallen guards. "You sold me to the rogues for mining rights, but in the silence of the waste, I found the frequency of your chains. I've learned how to pick the locks." I looked up at the scouts on the ridges. On my signal, they didn't howl. They didn't charge. They simply stood, silhouetted against the sun, a disciplined line of warriors who chose to be there. "Every wolf behind me is here because they want to be," I told my brother, who was now trembling, his alpha gold eyes flickering and fading. "Every wolf behind you is here because they have no choice. Which army do you think will fight harder when the sun goes down?" Kaelin looked at his elite warriors, men who were now whimpering on the ground, unlinked and broken. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he felt fear. Not of my claws, but of my existence. I was the living proof that his power was a lie. "This isn't over, Elara," he choked out, scrambling back toward his horse. "Father will burn this canyon to ash. You're a heretic. You're destroying the sacred bond." "No," I said, watching him gallop away in a cloud of dust and cowardice. "I'm just finishing the transaction." Chapter 5. We didn't march with drums or trumpets. An army of rogues doesn't move like a pack. We move like the wind through tall grass, unseen, unheard, but felt in the sudden chill of the air. Malachi stood at my side as we reached the overlook of the Silver-Crest Valley. Below us, the estate was glowing with lanterns. It looked peaceful, but I could feel the thrum of it, a heavy, oppressive psychic weight. My father had tightened the links. He was terrified, and a terrified alpha is a tyrant. "The gate is guarded by silver sensors," Malachi whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We can't brute force our way in without losing half our number." "We aren't here to break the gates," I said, pulling my dark cloak tighter. "We're here to open them." I didn't take the warriors. I took the unlinked, a small group of scouts whose psychic tethers I had personally erased. Because we had no link, we were invisible to the pack's supernatural radar. To the Silver-Crest sentries, we were just shadows. We slipped through the peripheral drainage tunnels, paths I had played in as a child. Coming back felt like entering a tomb. The air was thick with the forced loyalty of the pack. I could see the guards on the walls. They looked like statues, their eyes glazed, their minds completely submerged in my father's desperate command to watch. We reached the central courtyard. I saw my father, Alpha Thorn, standing on the balcony of the Great Hall. He was shouting at his generals, his voice booming with a hollow authority. "I don't care about the costs," Thorn roared. "If she is a void, then we drown her in numbers. Every wolf who can breathe will fight." I stepped out from the shadows of the stone pillar. I didn't shift. I didn't growl. I just stood in the center of the moonlight, a girl in leather armor standing where a princess used to curtsy. "You're still shouting, Father," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the psychic silence of the unlinked, it cut through his roar like a diamond through glass. "Don't you realize? No one is actually listening anymore. They're just obeying a habit." The guards turned, their spears leveled at me, but they hesitated. They looked at me, and they didn't see a rogue monster. They saw Elara, the girl they had traded away for a few miles of dirt. "Seize her!" Thorn screamed, his face contorting. But I didn't wait. I reached out and touched the ground. I didn't use strength. I used the void pulse. I sent a wave of absolute psychic nothingness through the stone floor, directly into the feet of every guard in the courtyard. The links didn't just break. They evaporated. "The gates are open, Malachi," I whispered into the night. From the shadows of the forest, the silent union emerged. They didn't come with claws out. They came with torches and the law. The revolution didn't start with a scream. It started with the terrifying, beautiful sound of 10,000 chains hitting the floor at once. The Great Hall of the Silver-Crest was no longer a place of celebration. It was a pressure cooker. Word of the silent revolution had spread like wildfire, and the Council of Alphas, the 7 leaders of the High Packs, had arrived with their elite guards, hoping to crush the Rogue Queen before her void pulse reached their borders. They sat on a raised semicircle of thrones, their collective alpha auras creating a golden light so intense it made the air shimmer with heat. In the center of the pit, I stood alone. No guards, no weapons, just the law of the land tucked into my belt. Elara of the Silver-Crest, the high alpha of the northern tundra, boomed, his voice like grinding ice. You are charged with high heresy. You have severed the sacred links, turned children against their fathers, and brought the chaos of the waste into the sanctity of the packs. Do you deny these crimes? I looked up at them. These were the men who had designed the system. They were the ones who decided who was high blood and who was debt payment. I deny the word crime, I said, my voice steady, amplified by the natural acoustics of the hall. A crime is a violation of a just law, but your laws aren't just. They are a ledger of ownership. You don't lead packs, you manage inventory. My father, Thorn, sat at the end of the row, his face a mask of shame and fury. She is a defect, he shouted to his peers, a broken vessel who has turned her emptiness into a weapon. Is it a defect to want to breathe without your permission, father? I asked, turning to face him. I stepped forward, and the high alphas tensed, their golden eyes flashing. They tried to press me, to use their combined psychic weight to crush me to the floor. The air grew heavy, like lead. The stone beneath my feet cracked under the spiritual pressure. But I didn't kneel. I opened the void. I didn't just negate their pressure, I mirrored it. I showed them what it felt like to be on the other side of the link. I projected the collective suffering of every debt bail girl, every weak omega cast into the waste, and every scout sent to die for an alpha's ego. This is the trial of blood, I declared, my voice echoing like a gavel, and the evidence is written in the scars of every rogue standing at my gates. You claim the link is for our protection, but you only use it to harvest our strength. You sold me to pay a debt. Well, I'm here to tell you that the debt is void. One by one, the alpha's golden auras began to flicker. They couldn't fight a vacuum. You cannot burn a fire where there is no oxygen, and you cannot command a soul that recognizes no master. The pack system ends tonight, I said, pulling the parchment of the new law from my belt. Not because I have conquered you, but because your people have seen that the silence is more beautiful than your roar. I looked at the guards lining the walls, the elite warriors of the 7 alphas. I didn't command them. I simply whispered to their minds, "You are free to choose." A ripple of confusion turned into a wave of realization. One guard dropped his spear, then another. The sound of metal hitting stone was the only verdict I needed. Chapter 6. The great hall felt like the epicenter of an earthquake that hadn't happened yet. The 7 alphas were gasping, their golden auras sputtering like dying candles. They were trying to hold on to their power, trying to tighten their psychic grip on the thousands of wolves outside these walls. You are a monster, my father wheezed, his hands trembling on the arms of his throne. If you do this, there will be chaos. Without the link, we are just beasts. We will tear each other apart. That is the lie you've told them for 1,000 years to keep them in line, I said, walking to the very center of the hall where the pack stone sat, a massive monolith of obsidian that acted as a psychic amplifier for the alpha link across the entire territory. I placed both hands on the cold, vibrating stone. You think the link is what makes us a pack, I whispered, closing my eyes. But it's just a leash. Real unity doesn't need a chain. It needs a choice. I didn't just open the void this time. I inverted it. I reached deep into that empty space in my soul, the defect that had made me a pariah, and I turned it into a broadcast. I didn't send out a command. I sent out silence. I released the global void pulse. The sensation was like a giant rubber band snapping simultaneously in a million minds. Across the continent, Alphas fell to their knees as their divine connection was severed. Mothers looked at their children and saw them, truly saw them, without the filter of a leader's will. Soldiers dropped their swords, the red fog of commanded bloodlust evaporating instantly. In the great hall, the golden light vanished entirely. The alphas were just men, pale, sweating, and terrified. "It's gone," the high alpha of the tundra whispered, staring at his hands. "I can't feel them. I can't feel any of them." "Good," I said, stepping away from the now inert packstone. "Now you have to talk to them like equals. Now you have to earn their respect instead of demanding their souls." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of a long overdue mourning. Outside, I didn't hear the sounds of wolves tearing each other apart. I heard something much more terrifying to a tyrant. I heard thousands of wolves, for the first time in history, asking the person standing next to them, "What do we do now?" The system was dead. The debt was cancelled. The world was wide open. The morning after the abolition was the quietest in history. The Great Hall, once a place of terrifying power, was now just a room of stone and shadows. The 7 alphas had fled, not as kings in exile, but as lonely men who realized their subjects no longer recognized the weight of their crowns. I walked out onto the balcony overlooking the Silver-Crest Valley. Malachi stood beside me, his scarred face illuminated by a sun that felt brighter, as if the psychic clouds had finally parted. Below us, thousands of wolves were gathered. There was no bowing, no rhythmic chanting of an alpha's name. There was just a vast, murmuring sea of people talking, debating, and simply being. "They're waiting for a speech," Malachi rasped, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade he no longer needed to use. "They're waiting for you to tell them who their new master is." "Then they'll be waiting a long time," I replied. I stepped to the edge of the stone railing. I didn't use the void to suppress them. I used the silence to hold space for them. When I spoke, it was the voice of the woman who had survived the waste, not the daughter who had been sold to it. "Yesterday you were property," I called out. "Yesterday your blood was a currency for men who sat on thrones. Today the ledger is closed. There is no Silver-Crest. There are no bone-eaters. There is only the land, and there is only the law." I unrolled the parchment I had carried from the rogue camps, the new covenant. "We will not have alphas," I declared. "We will have counselors. We will not have packs. We will have communities. No wolf shall be bound to another by mind, only by contract and consent. If you stay because you choose to build. If you leave with your soul intact." A roar went up. Not a commanded howl, but a spontaneous, chaotic, beautiful cheer. Malachi turned to me, a rare smile breaking through his scars. "You realize what you've done? You've made yourself the most powerful woman in the world, only to give that power away." "That's the secret, Malachi," I said, looking out at the horizon. "Power isn't something you hold. It's something you share. My father thought I was a debt to be paid. He didn't realize that by selling me, he gave me the one thing he could never own, the truth." By noon, the silent union began its work. We started drafting the boundaries of the new territories, not based on hunting grounds, but on resources and trade. The law of the land was no longer a dream. It was the foundation of the first wolf society built on the principles of sovereignty and self-determination. The debt bale was gone. The sovereign had arrived. The epilogue. 10 years have passed since the abolition, and the world of the wolves is unrecognizable. The jagged, ash-colored gray waste is no longer a desert for the discarded. It is the heart of the sovereign commons, a bustling city of stone, glass, and greenery where the old pack names, Silver-Crest, Stoneclaw, Bone-Eater, have faded into the history books. I sit in the Hall of Records, not on a throne, but at a large circular table. My hair is silvering at the temples, and the leather armor has been replaced by robes of deep indigo. Beside me, Malachi, now the head of the Civil Guard, reads a report on the latest harvest trade with the humans. We don't have alphas anymore. We have arbitrators. We don't have blood debts. We have civic duties. I look out the window at the schoolyard below. I see children from 7 different former packs playing together. They don't feel each other's thoughts. They don't have a voice in their heads telling them who to hate or who to hunt. They have to learn to share, to argue, and to apologize. They are learning to be individuals. Sometimes, a traveler comes from the distant wild lands, still clutching the old ways, searching for the alpha of the waste. They expect to find a monster. Instead, they find me, a woman who spends her days mediating water rights and her nights reading by the fire. They still tell stories about you, Malachi says, placing a hand on my shoulder. In the far north, they call you the Void Bringer. They say you stole the souls of the wolves. I didn't steal them, I reply, looking at my hands, the hands that once wore silver-lined silk and later broke the world's most powerful spell. I just gave them back to their rightful owners. My father, Thorn, lives in a small cottage on the edge of the valley. He is no longer an alpha. He is a gardener. He doesn't have a pack to command, but he has the finest roses in the territory. Sometimes when I walk past, he looks at me with a mixture of confusion and a strange, quiet relief. He finally realized that the weight of the crown was what was truly breaking him. The sun sets over the sovereign commons, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the wolves don't howl in a synchronized, eerie chorus of obedience. They howl when they are happy. They howl when they are sad. They howl because they want to feel the vibration of their own voices in their own chests. I am Elara. I was sold to pay a debt, but I ended up bankrupting a tyrant's world. The land is quiet, the law is firm. And at last, we are all free. Elara's legacy wasn't a kingdom, but a set of rules that applied to everyone equally. What is the law you live your own life by? What is the one principle that no one can ever trade or take away from you? Let's share our personal covenants in the comments. Thank you for being part of this legend. If you loved Elara's story, like the video and check out my other underdog to ruler tales. Until the next moon rises, stay sovereign.